The morning Francesca Harrington agreed to marry Virgil Cobb, her hands were shaking. Not from happiness, not even from nerves. They were shaking because her oldest friend had pulled her aside the night before, pressed both palms flat against Francesca's shoulders, and said something that hadn't left her mind since. "He doesn't love you, Franny. He's doing this to settle a score with your father." Those words sat in her chest like a stone all through breakfast. They sat there while she dressed, and while she pinned her hair, while she watched Virgil from the upstairs window as he stood in the yard below, hat in hand, speaking quietly to her father with the kind of patience that didn't look like a man planning anything cruel. But then again, Francesca had learned young that the most dangerous kind of man was the patient one. She was 24 years old, the only daughter of Gerald Harrington, who owned the largest cattle operation in Cutter's Bend, Colorado. Gerald was not a soft man. But he had built everything he had through deals that not everyone agreed with and decisions that had left certain families worse off than before. Francesca had grown up knowing that. She had grown up watching men tip their hats to her father on the street and say nothing honest to his face. Virgil Cobb had come to Cutter's Bend 3 years ago with little more than a bedroll, a horse, and a reputation for being the best fence and ground man in the territory. Gerald had hired him inside of a week. But within a year, Virgil was managing the South pastures. Within 2, he was trusted with the ranch books. And now, he had asked to marry Gerald's daughter. The town had opinions. Cutter's Bend always did. "He came from nothing," said the woman who ran the dry goods store, to anyone who would listen. "Men like that don't rise that fast without wanting something." What nobody said out loud, but most people thought, was that Virgil Cobb had once had a younger brother. Yet and that brother had borrowed money from Gerald Harrington years ago, before Virgil arrived in town, and that the debt had gone badly. The details were murky, the way small-town histories always were, but the shape of the story was familiar enough. A powerful man, a desperate loan, and a family that ended up with less than it started with. Francesca knew some of this. Not all of it. Her father had never been forthcoming about his business, and she had never pushed hard enough to find out. Well, maybe she hadn't wanted to know. But Darlene Hobbs, her oldest friend, who had grown up 2 properties over and knew every rumor in Cutter's Bend before it was fully formed, had connected the pieces in a way that was hard to ignore. "Your father ruined his brother, Franny," Darlene had told her. "And now Virgil Cobb is about to own half of everything your father built. You think that's a coincidence?" The thing was, Francesca had noticed Virgil long before the engagement, and she would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. She had noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the frame around it. He was quiet in a way that wasn't timid. He worked without complaining, and rested without apologizing for it. He said what he meant in about half the words most men used. And he had a habit, small, probably unconscious, of going still when someone else was speaking, like the words actually mattered to him. She had never spoken to him much, that twice over supper when her father invited the ranch hands to eat inside during a bad winter. Once by the water pump, when she'd needed help with a bucket that had stuck a handful of times in passing. He had never been forward, never hovered, never looked at her in the way some men did, like she was something belonging to her father that they were already calculating how to acquire. That had puzzled her a little, if she was honest. But now Darlene's words rearranged everything. Maybe his distance hadn't been respect. Maybe it had been strategy. Virgil came to the house that evening to share supper, as had become customary in the weeks since the engagement was announced. Gerald sat at the head of the table, broad and self-satisfied, cutting his meat with the confidence of a man who believed he had arranged something favorable. Francesca sat across from Virgil and tried to eat normally. She studied him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was 31. We leaned from years of outdoor work, with dark hair that had started to show the first threads of gray at the temples. His face was not handsome in any easy way, but it held something, a steadiness, a kind of quiet that made other men seem restless by comparison. His hands, she had noticed, were always still when he wasn't using them. No drumming of fingers, no fidgeting. He glanced up once and caught her watching him. She looked down at her plate. The north fence line held through the storm," he said to her father, as though nothing had happened. Gerald nodded. "Knew it would. You reinforced it right." Francesca said nothing, but she felt the moment settle around her strangely, the way the air feels before rain. She couldn't decide if Virgil had seen her watching and chosen to ignore it, or if he simply had nothing to hide. She wanted it to be the second thing. She was afraid it was the first. After supper, Gerald went to smoke on the porch the way he always did, leaving Francesca to clear the table. Virgil stood to help, which was not what ranch hands typically did, and certainly not what her father's men did as a rule. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said, and picked up 2 plates anyway. They worked in silence for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the sun was going down behind the ridge and turning the dust in the yard a deep copper color. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and before she had fully decided to. He set the plates beside the basin and looked at her. "You can." She almost said it. She had the words ready. She wanted to ask him plainly, why her? Why now? What exactly he believed he was building here. But something in the steadiness of his expression stopped her, not because it frightened her, because it didn't. "Never mind," she said. "It'll keep." He nodded once, slowly, as though he understood that she had pulled something back and was willing to wait for it. He dried his hands on the cloth by the basin, said goodnight, and walked out through the back door. Francesca stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to his boots on the back steps. Whatever she had expected from him, it wasn't that. 2 days later, she went looking for Darlene. She found her behind the milliner's shop, where Darlene sometimes helped with alterations in the afternoon. At the moment Darlene saw her face, she set down the fabric she was working with and waited. "Tell me everything you know," Francesca said. "Not the shape of it, the details." Darlene pulled in a slow breath. "You sure you want it? I'm about to marry the man." Darlene nodded and folded her hands in her lap. "All right. What I know for certain is this. Virgil had a younger brother named Walter. About 8 years ago, Walter came to your father looking for a loan to buy a small piece of land east of the ridge. Your father gave it to him, but the terms were steep. Walter couldn't keep up with the payments. Your father called in the debt inside of 18 months and took the land. Walter left Cutter's Bend after that. Folks say he went north. Some say he didn't make it far." Francesca was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean? Didn't make it far?" "Nobody knows for certain. But Virgil came here not long after, and he came with purpose. That much everyone agrees on." The word purpose landed strangely. It could mean so many things. "Did he ever say anything to you?" Francesca asked. "About any of it?" "Virgil Cobb doesn't say things to people," Darlene said. "That's part of what worries me." Francesca walked home slowly, taking the long way along the creek that ran behind the south pasture. She needed the time and the quiet. The creek was low from the dry weeks, the stones along its banks bleached pale in the afternoon sun. She stopped once and sat on a flat rock and tried to think clearly. Here was what she knew. Virgil had come to Cutter's Bend after his brother lost everything to her father, and he had worked his way into her father's trust over 3 years with patience and competence, and now he was marrying into the family. It had the shape of a plan. She couldn't deny that. But there was something else she kept returning to, something that didn't fit the shape neatly. It was a small thing, a memory from almost 2 years ago. She had been riding back from town alone one afternoon when her horse had stumbled on a loose stone and thrown her. She'd landed hard on her side in the scrub. It had nothing broken but her pride and one of her coat buttons. By the time she had gotten to her feet and caught the horse's reins again, Virgil had appeared from somewhere along the fence line, on foot, moving at a pace that told her he had seen her fall and come immediately. He hadn't made a fuss, hadn't over-explained himself. He'd checked the horse's leg with quiet efficiency, then looked at her once, just once, with an expression she hadn't been able to classify then and still couldn't now. Yet it wasn't the look of a man calculating. It was something else entirely. She had told herself she was imagining things. It was easier that way. But sitting by the creek with Darlene's words still fresh, she found herself wondering for the first time whether she had been too quick to explain it away. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out. That was 6 weeks to learn what she could. 6 weeks to watch and decide. But 6 weeks to figure out whether she was walking toward a man who had quietly cared for her in ways she hadn't recognized, or whether she was about to become the final piece in someone else's long and patient plan. That night, lying in the dark of her room with the window open and the sound of the ranch settling around her, Francesca stared at the ceiling and thought about Virgil's hands going still on the edge of the table when he listened, at the way he had picked up those plates without being asked, the way he had said "you can" when she asked if she could ask him something. Not of course, not sure, just a plain and honest "you can." She thought about the look on his face by the creek 2 years ago, and then she thought about Walter, and she couldn't make those two things fit into the same man, which meant one of them wasn't what it looked like. She just didn't know yet which one. The following morning, but Francesca did something she had never done before. She went to the ranch records room. Her father kept everything in a locked cedar cabinet beside his desk. Ledgers, loan papers, land deeds, correspondence going back 15 years. She had never had reason to go through them before. She had never wanted to. But she was going to be a married woman in 6 weeks. And if this ranch and its history were about to become her future, and she felt she had earned the right to understand what she was stepping into. Gerald had ridden out early to check on a water issue at the north well. She had 2 hours, maybe 3. The cabinet was locked, but she knew where her father kept the key. He had shown her once, years ago, in case of emergency. She wasn't sure this qualified. She went and got it anyway. It took her 20 minutes to find the right ledger. The loan to Walter Cobb was recorded in plain ink, neat and businesslike, and the way her father recorded everything. The terms were there in full. Francesca read them twice. By the second reading, her jaw was tight. The interest rate was nearly double what any fair lender would have asked. The repayment window was short, in a way that would have been difficult for an established man, let alone a young one starting from nothing. And there was a clause near the bottom, written small, meant that allowed Gerald to call in the full balance at any time if he deemed the borrower unlikely to meet future payments. He had used that clause at 14 months. Walter Cobb had never had a real chance. The loan had been structured to fail. Francesca sat back in her father's chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She had known her father was hard. She had not known he was this deliberate about it. She put the ledger back exactly as she had found it, locked the cabinet, and returned the key. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked out into the morning air and breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest eased. She found Virgil at the water trough near the south barn, working through a repair on one of the gate hinges. He looked up when he heard her coming and set down his tools without being asked. She got straight to the point. I read the loan agreement between my father and your brother. Something moved across his face, not surprise, yet more like a door opening slightly that had been closed for a long time. When? He said. This morning. He was quiet. He picked up a cloth and wiped his hands, slowly, giving himself time. Then he looked at her. What did you want to know? Whether Darlene was right, Francesca said. Whether this, the job, the trust, the engagement, whether it was all about settling something. The wind moved through the yard between them. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the horses shifted and stamped, but Virgil looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, not defensive, just looking, the way he always did, like he was deciding how much honesty the situation could hold. When I came here, he said, I was angry. That part's true. Walter lost everything, and it broke him, and I needed someone to blame. Your father was easy to blame. So you came here to take something back, she said. I came here to understand how a man like your father operated, he said. I told myself that's all it was. He paused. I stayed because of the work. And then, he stopped. And then what? He looked down briefly, then back at her. And then I saw you fall off your horse one afternoon and get right back up without making a sound about it. And I didn't go home that evening feeling angry anymore. The words landed quietly, without decoration. Francesca held his gaze and said nothing for a moment. That was almost 2 years ago. Yes, he said simply. You didn't say anything. You were Gerald Harrington's daughter. I was a hired hand with a grievance against your family. What exactly was I supposed to say? She had no answer for that. The days that followed were different. Not resolved, not yet, but different in the way a room feels when a window gets opened. Francesca stopped watching Virgil for evidence of a plan and started watching him the way she should have from the beginning. She noticed things she had explained away before. That's the way he always made sure the older ranch hands had the easier tasks without making it obvious. The way he remembered things people mentioned once in passing. A sick mother, a leaking roof, and quietly followed up. The way he spoke to her father with patience, even when her father was being unreasonable, which was often. He was not a perfect man. He had a temper he kept on a short leash, and there were mornings he was distant in a way that made conversation difficult. When he didn't explain himself easily and didn't apologize quickly, he was private to the point of being occasionally frustrating. But he was not cruel. He was not scheming. And every time she tested that conclusion, it held. Darlene came by one afternoon and found Francesca in better spirits than expected. You don't look like a woman being deceived, Darlene said, studying her. I don't think I am, Francesca said. You trust him? Francesca considered the question honestly. I'm starting to. Darlene was quiet for a moment. Be careful, Franny. I intend to, she said, but being careful doesn't mean assuming the worst about everyone. The wedding was simple, held on a clear morning in early October, with the mountains visible from the yard, and the air carrying the first real chill of autumn. Francesca had not told her father what she had found in the ledger. Not yet. That conversation was coming, but it was not for today. But today she stood beside Virgil in front of the small congregation of ranch hands and townspeople and said what she meant when she said it, which was the only way she knew how to do things. Virgil's voice was steady when he spoke his vows. His hands were still, the way they always were. Afterward, when the guests had moved toward the long table set up in the yard, he found a moment beside her where it was just the two of them, and he said quietly, I want you to know something. She looked at him. I came here angry, he said. That was true, but I never used you, not once. I need you to know that. I know, she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "I've been watching you for weeks, Virgil Cobb," she said. "You're not as hard to read as you think you are." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but close. The conversation with her father came 3 weeks after the wedding, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Gerald was in good spirits and the ranch was calm. Now Francesca sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him plainly what she had found in the ledger. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out what the terms had been and asked him to explain them honestly. Gerald was silent for a long moment. He was not a man who admitted things easily, but he was also, underneath the hardness, a man who respected directness. Francesca had always been direct, and part of him had always respected that in her, even when it inconvenienced him. "The terms were steep," he said finally. "They were designed to fail," she said. He didn't answer that, which was, in its own way, an answer. "Walter Cobb was not a careful borrower," Gerald said. "He was 22 years old," Francesca said. "And you knew exactly what you were doing." The silence stretched. Gerald looked at his hands on the table. "Is this about Virgil?" he asked. "This is about what's right," she said. "Virgil has never asked me to have this conversation. He doesn't know I'm having it." That seemed to affect her father more than anything else she had said. Gerald Harrington did not transform overnight. He was too old and too set for that. But he was not entirely without conscience, and his daughter's steady, unsentimental honesty had a way of getting through the places where anger and pride could not. He reached out to find Walter Cobb, and it took several weeks and the help of a man in Denver who located people for a fee. Walter was alive, living in a small settlement north of the territory line, working as a carpenter, quiet and solitary in the way that people become when something has been taken from them that they never fully recovered. Gerald wrote him a letter. It was not eloquent. It acknowledged what had happened in plain terms and made an offer, a portion of land, the original plot Walter had tried to buy, at which had since been incorporated into the Harrington property and was currently unused. Walter did not respond for 6 weeks. When he did, his letter was short. He said he would come and see the land before deciding anything. Virgil found out the morning Walter's letter arrived. Francesca handed it to him across the breakfast table without explanation and watched his face as he read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down carefully. "Your father did this," he said. "With a conversation I started," she said honestly. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the morning was bright and cold, the mountains sharp against the sky. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "But it was right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice he used when something mattered more than he knew how to say, "I came here with a stone in my chest, Francesca. I've been carrying it so long, I forgot what it felt like not to." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Maybe you can put it down now," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe I can." Walter came in November, when the first snow had dusted the upper ridges and the ranch was moving into its slower season. He was quieter than Virgil, with the same stillness but fewer edges, worn down by years rather than sharpened by them. He and Virgil stood together in the yard for a long time the morning he arrived. Francesca watched from the kitchen window without intruding. She couldn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. What she saw was enough. 2 brothers standing in the cold morning air, the years and the distance between them slowly, quietly closing. Walter looked at the land. He walked it twice over 2 days, alone and without hurry. On the 3rd morning, he told Gerald he would take it. Gerald shook his hand. What, it was not a warm moment, but it was an honest one. Sometimes that is enough. By the following spring, Walter had built a small structure on his plot and was working the ground with the methodical patience of a man who had learned not to rush things. He came to supper at Virgil and Francesca's table every Sunday. He didn't talk much, but he ate well, and he stayed long. And after a while, the quietness between the three of them stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like something settled. Francesca watched her husband across the table on those Sunday evenings. The stone he had carried was not entirely gone. Some things don't disappear completely. They just stop pressing so hard. But there was an ease in him now that had not been there before, a willingness to laugh at small things, and a way of sitting in a room that said he had somewhere to be and someone to be there with. Darlene came by one afternoon in April, when the yard was muddy from spring rain and the trees along the creek were pushing out their first green. "Well," she said, looking at Francesca's face with the appraising eye of a woman who notices everything. "I was wrong about him." "You were working with incomplete information," Francesca said generously. "I was wrong," Darlene said firmly, because she was honest that way. "He's a good man." "He's a complicated man," Francesca said. "But yes, he's good." Darlene smiled. "The complicated ones usually are." Nobody in Cutter's Bend ever fully stopped having opinions about Virgil Cobb. That was not how small towns worked. But the shape of the story changed over time, the way stories do when the truth starts filling in the gaps. People saw how he ran the ranch, fairly, without favoritism, but with the kind of steady competence that kept things working without drama. They saw the way he treated Francesca, not with grand gestures, but with the daily, consistent consideration that matters more over a lifetime than any single moment. They saw Walter Cobb on his land, east of the ridge, building something quiet and real. And slowly, the version of events that Darlene had once whispered in urgency, the revenge, the scheme, the score to settle, began to seem like what it had always been, and a story built from the outside, by people looking at the shape of things and filling in the middle with what seemed most likely. They had been wrong. Most of them knew it. Few of them said so directly, because that was not how small towns worked either. But they tipped their hats to Virgil Cobb on the street, and they meant it. One last thing before you go. Somewhere out there, someone is reading these words, maybe curled up at home, maybe on a long commute, or maybe in a quiet corner of the world I'd never think to imagine. I'd love to know where this story has traveled. What part of the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Your city, your country, even just your corner of the earth. It genuinely means something to know how far a simple story can reach. And if you have thoughts, something you'd like to see done differently, a kind of story you'd love to hear next, a detail that felt off, or a moment that landed just right, please say so. Every comment shapes the next story. Your voice matters here more than you might think.